Good morning, class. Today we're going to continue our discussion on the Civil Rights Movement leading up to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we're going to start today in 1963, particularly the summer or almost summer of 1963. So we had talked yesterday about Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, and then Rosa Parks and her appeal, which led to busing being desegregated in 1956 was the ruling, but busing isn't really desegregated until 1962. So now we're in 63, and schools still aren't all desegregated or they're not all integrated. So as tensions are growing and this issue is heating up, there's a governor in Alabama, Governor Wallace, and Governor Wallace is a very ardent segregationalist, and he's trying to stop desegregation in schools. So he actually stands outside of the University of Alabama, blocking the way to the admissions office, and he's refusing to let two African Americans come through to be admitted to the University of Alabama. And he gives a speech saying segregation now, segregation forever, which it's very hard to understand in our time today, which is a good thing. I think what he was doing was bad. It was horrible. So I'm glad that in our modern culture, we can't understand why someone would have this mindset or why someone would do this, or ever think that segregation was something to be supported. But Governor Wallace did think that. And federal marshals actually had to force him to move out of the way to allow these African American students to be admitted. And about a day later, there was a person by the name of Medgar Evers. And Medgar Evers was an NAACP activist and a civil rights activist. And Medgar Evers was murdered about a day after this, and largely in response to the tensions that are surrounding this desegregation push for civil rights in the South. And this is a very tragic thing that occurs, but it just shows that there's a cost associated with supporting the civil rights movement. And a lot of these activists realized that their health and well-being was on the line, so much so that some of them were murdered. Uh, so fast forward a little bit in the summer into August. So on August 28th, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and about 250,000 other people assemble in Washington, D.C. And this is called the March on Washington. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gives, at this point in time, his famous I Have a Dream speech. All right, so he's speaking, and by the way, we have the transcript of the original speech, and I find it really interesting. I just found this out about a year and a half ago, that the I Have a Dream portion of his speech was not actually in his transcript. It wasn't in his notes. That was more extemporaneous. So, now, granted, he had given that speech before, but he wasn't planning to give it there in that moment. But that's the most memorable part of his speech that he gave, is the I Have a Dream portion of his speech. And it really energized the populace, and a lot of people really resonated with Dr. Martin Luther King and with what he was saying. So now let's fast forward a little bit into 1964. So in July of 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law. It was proposed and passed in February, and it had bills take a long time. They have to someone has to sponsor the bill. So a bill has to be written, it has to be sponsored, whether it's in the House or in the Senate. And then it has to go to a committee, it has to be heard in committee, it has to be voted on in committee, it has to be heard on the House, and then it has to be brought up for a vote in the House, and then if it's passed, it has to go to the Senate, and the Senate has to make a similar bill, or almost with the same exact verbiage, and then they have to do all the same things, and then if the Senate passes it, then it goes to the president's desk, and then if the president signs it, it becomes law. Well, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 finally made it through all of that and was signed in July by the president, and so it became law. And this is momentous. This is huge because it does several things. First of all, one thing that it does is that it makes segregation illegal in all public places. Um, and that had not happened before. So that's amazing and it's great and it's a huge, huge advancement for civil rights. Also, it gave the U.S. Attorney more power to force desegregation in schools and other areas. And it forbade employers, private employers, from using segregationist tactics while hiring. So there couldn't be discrimination based on race anymore in hiring. So this is a massive victory for the civil rights movement. But it's still not enough because while this is law, there is still a lot of tension over voting rights. We talked about the Civil Rights Act of 57 and how it was supposed to expand voting rights and protect voting rights for African Americans. But that's more on a federal level, and states are still allowed to make voting laws. To this day, states make their own voting laws. That's why some states have primaries and some states don't. Some states have a caucus, for example. Anyway, back here to 1965. In January of 1965, in Selma, Alabama, we see what's called the Selma riots. All right, so police terrorize peaceful African American demonstrators. All right, so this is a peaceful protest, and police just use strong arm tactics. And by the way, this is in no way saying anything about police in general. This is saying about these specific officers in this specific place at this specific time are under orders, and they follow these orders to just brutalize African Americans that are demonstrating, and over 3,000 African Americans are arrested during this time. It's a massive number, and a lot of them are injured and other things, and it's just a very bad time for African Americans that are demonstrating in certain areas, particularly in the South and particularly in Alabama, because the Selma area in 65 is going to be like the center of the civil rights movement. So in Selma, something occurs a little later called the March for Freedom. So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to organize people, and they're going to march from Selma to Montgomery. It's about a 50-mile march. It's a long walk, by the way, to protest voting discrimination against African Americans. So the sheriff and his deputies arrive, and they block the passage of African Americans across a bridge. And then they proceed to beat these. It's a peaceful, completely peaceful protest. Okay, I've watched video of this particular portion of the protest. It's just a completely peaceful, organized, orderly, quiet march. And the police show up, they block the passage of these African Americans across the bridge, and then they beat over 70 of the marchers. And America sees this televised, and it makes America extremely angry. America, in general, is very unhappy about this occurring because we're able to see. It's one thing to read in the newspapers because I'm sure if you've read different news outlets, you're aware that every organization puts their spin on a story, right? On both sides. So what we see here is it's televised. And so people can actually see the event for themselves, and they can draw their own conclusions. And the conclusions that most Americans draw, the conclusion they draw is, this is ridiculous. This should never happen. So immediately following this, Congress gets to work at the behest of the president, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is passed. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 does a few things, but it completely ends things like literacy tests or poll taxes or other things that were used to prohibit African Americans from voting. And this is another major victory in the civil rights movement. So really, the hallmark years in the civil rights movement as far as major advancement that we see: 1954, Brown versus Board of Education; 1956 with the ruling on busing segregation; 62 where buses are desegregated because of freedom riders; uh, 64 Civil Rights Act of 1964, and 65 with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These are big years in which big things occur in the civil rights movement. But all of this momentum has been built up over years, really over decades. And it's the fruit of the work of a lot of people that worked very hard, very diligently, very tirelessly to advance civil rights. So, what I want you to get for today is that all the work that was done is it culminates in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And those are two watershed moments in America for the civil rights movement. And really, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and a lot of people that had listened to him and worked alongside of him uh, were responsible for energizing America to get behind these things. So it's very encouraging to look back in history and see that though there were wrongs, that people worked really hard to right these wrongs, and it's the American people and individuals in America that are willing to go out there and willing to take risks to change something that's wrong in America. So that's how these things got passed, is at the grassroots level. People start protesting. They start organizing people to protest. They start organizing people to get the message out. And then eventually change occurred because of their consistent efforts. So that's it for today. And then we'll plan to live stream tomorrow. I'll send you out an email tomorrow morning about that. Keep up the good work, everybody. Have a great day.